Hey everybody, welcome to Example of Play, the home for strategy and tactics gaming. If you haven't subscribed already, now's your chance to hit that button. Today's video is going to continue my tutorial series for Strategic Command War in the Pacific. This video is going to focus on naval units. So we're going to talk about naval movement, talk about naval supply, naval combat, just dive in each of those topics and kind of look at some quirks of what makes the naval units different from the ground units. Obviously, this being the Pacific theater, we're looking at a huge amount of naval territory, and handling those units correctly is going to be very important in this game. First things first, let's look at just basic movement. So it's very similar to how the ground units move, just that we're talking bigger distances. So most of your naval units are going to have 18 action points, a little different than the ground units, which vary widely in how far they can move. Ships all move about the same distance in a turn. So if we want to move around, we just click on them. We can see all these blue hexes highlighted that they can move to. And just like with the ground units, if we hold down control, we can also set waypoints, which with the naval units can be a lot more flexible and important because you might be wanting to maneuver through some of these gaps between the islands in a certain way. If you know there's an enemy force blocking one route, you might want to have your ships move the other way. And to do that, you just hold down control. You'll see and when you click, you'll see the line turns black, and then it'll update to show how much further you can move. And so you can actually set pretty detailed waypoints, and then there we stumbled right into some Japanese ships. Probably not going to be a good day for the Houston heavy cruiser there. But that is how you do basic movement. And then just like with ground units can do forced march, naval units can do naval cruise, which this one can't do. I think I actually moved to him already before I started the video. So if we do that, we see naval cruise right there. We can click that, or you can just click again on the unit and you'll see the hexes turn orange. Now we're doing naval cruise. This is like forced march. It lets us move further, but it comes at a cost. So it lets us move 36 hexes, which is a pretty huge distance. But if we're looking at the Pacific theater, there is a lot of water, especially getting from the United States, from the West Coast all the way to the theater. Over here, it's crowded. There's tons of islands, tons of ports, a lot of action over here, but a lot of water in between. And so for a unit to get from, let's say, San Francisco in one turn, using that naval cruise, they can get to Hawaii, but now they're only, a third of the way to even getting in the region where most of the action is going to be happening. So definitely something to think about. Even after you get a naval unit built over here, it's going to take several turns just to get them over here. And you might want to be thinking about, do I want them to arrive down here? Do I want them to arrive up here? Because it's going to be several turns of movement involved. Now, what is the cost whenever we do that naval cruise? It's going to use, so first off, you can only do it if your unit has at least 5 supply. And then you're going to use one of those supply points every time they naval cruise. So you're kind of running them ragged, moving faster, and you're going to be eating up their supply, which, as we'll see with naval units, is a little bit different than ground units with how supply works, because they are going to kind of burn through it as they do movement, as they do combat, and they might need to go back to port to get more supplies, versus a ground unit, which is, as long as they're in range of supply, they're going to typically stay in supply. The other cost is that whenever you do this, you can't fight. So if you move really far and you slam right into some enemy ships, you're not going to be able to fight them. And then the amphibious units cannot do the naval cruise. So if we load, say we got these Marines here, as you saw in the last video, we can load them into an amphibious transport, been in these points. But you would not want to do that here in San Francisco because they can't naval cruise, and they actually are gonna, we'll talk about them in a little more detail later, but basically don't do amphibious transport here on the West Coast and expect to cruise all the way across the ocean and land, because they're not going to make it. They're going to burn up their supplies the longer they're at sea. In some strategic command games, there is the option of, didn't mean to do that. There is the option of long range amphibious transports, which act more like the other ships, but in this game those are turned off. specifically to avoid gamey things like cruising a Marine landing force all the way across the ocean and landing directly. Submarines are a little bit special in how they can move. So as you can imagine, a submarine can be in two different modes. So the normal mode is hunt, in which case they're going to move a little further. They're going to act more like the other ships on the surface. But if we switch them, if you come down here to set mode, we switch them to silent, that's going to reduce how far they can move. But when they're moving silently, it's harder for the enemy ships to detect them, and they can even pass through enemy units that are blocking some location, as long as it's not an enemy destroyer. If it's so it's larger, anything besides an enemy destroyer, they can actually move past them, be harder to detect, and if they attack while in silent mode, if an enemy ship just bumps into them, they can do a stronger attack. Submarines can also dive, so they have a percentage chance of escaping damage when they're attacked, and they'll just automatically move away from an enemy unit. And that's something you can improve by researching advanced subs. It's going to increase their chance of surviving attacks and getting away. So if you're going to use a lot of subs, you're going to want to research that to increase those chances. Now, as I mentioned, naval supply works a little bit differently than it does for the ground units, where you have supply coming from different locations. You have headquarters that can boost supply. For naval units, supply is entirely dependent on friendly ports. So whenever you move away from a friendly port, they're going to be out of supply, and they're not going to have any way to resupply until they go close to a port. So if we hit S to bring up supply, you've seen this before, but we're going to pay attention to, we're not going to look at the ground spaces at all. We're just going to be looking at the naval spaces. And we'll see that most of them are going to max out at 8. So everywhere we have a friendly port, we have 8. And then as we move away from that port, the supply level goes down. Some of these here, we can't see further out just because we don't have visibility on those spaces. We come over here where we have a lot more visibility. We can see those go all the way out to like 1 supply out here. There are major ports that give supply of 12, but those are typically going to be only in certain places. Most of your ports are going to be regular ports, and they're going to give a supply of 8. Unless your ship actually parks in port, they're not going to be able to get to 10 supply. They're only going to be able to get to 8 without actually going into port, and that'll bump them up to 10. So this is really important, obviously, for your strategy as you are moving through the Pacific. This highlights why in the real life campaign it was so important to take these ports one at a time to kind of leapfrog through the islands and push from one to the next, because if you don't, then you're out of supply. It's going to be hard to sustain operations, because the way supply works with naval units is that every time they go into combat, whether they're attacking or defending, each combat is going to take away 1 supply. And then doing the naval cruise is going to take away 1 supply. And so you can see that if you just steam some ships, like if you have a new fleet built here and you just steam straight across the Pacific and get into combat, they're going to be out of supply real quick. And so if you don't have a friendly port to retreat to, or to stop in to resupply after coming across before going into combat, they're going to be combat ineffective really quick. So let's just look and see if we do this attack here. We're going to see their supply drop. So it dropped down to 9. And then if these ships attack it on the Japanese turn, it's going to eat up some more supply. And so real quick, you can see you can go from 10 down to very little if we're not in range of a friendly port to get more supplies. So that I hope highlights for you how supply works and how you need to take ports, and you need to base your operations out of friendly ports so that your ships can keep topped off and keep in combat longer. All right, so now having seen a little combat there, we'll talk about combat in a little more detail. So naval combat, the basics of it are pretty simple, pretty straightforward, or pretty comparable to combat for ground units. Like we saw there, basically you select them if you're adjacent, so there's not any ranged attacks other than carriers, which we'll get to. But for most of your naval combat ships, you're going to need to be adjacent to the enemy unit. And then you'll see these combat odds just like with the ground units. So the 1 and 1 here means we would expect the Americans to take 1 hit and the Japanese to take 1 hit. But that's not certain. It depends on all sorts of factors, like we mentioned before, of what kind of the morale, the readiness, supply level, all of that plays into what sets up these odds. And then they're a little bit random. It could be plus or minus 1 or 2, depending on the combat. But to do it, you just roll up, click on them, combat's going to happen. And then if they still have action points left, ships can move away. So you could run in there, hit them, and then back away. Obviously, just like in real life, the spotting, knowing where the enemy naval ships are is a huge factor. So it's 1 unit per hex. So if you know there's a carrier out here that's exposed, you find it, you could move some ships in there real fast and gang up on it and knock it out and then retreat before the enemy ships show up and find you. Combat for losing or destroying enemy ships is more high stakes than ground units because as we saw in one of the earlier videos, building these ships takes a long time. So like a heavy cruiser takes 12 months in the game for it to build. Battleship takes 15. That's a long time. That's a lot of investment in that unit. And so losing it actually causes a national morale hit. That's double what it is for ground units, or it's doubled depending on the value of the ship. And so losing, destroying, or having one of your ships get lost can ding your national morale a fair amount. And so like getting a fleet wiped out is not just like you losing a ground force would be bad. It might set back your campaign a bit, but losing a whole naval force is going to set your national morale back, could cost you the game. So you want to be careful with your naval units and not just throw them to the wind. Besides, like we mentioned, just getting, from here all the way over here and then immediately getting a ship knocked out is really bad. So naval combat, a little more high stakes than the ground combat, just because of the cost, the investment in each unit. Now the units, we'll kind of talk about the ships. There are a variety of ships, but there's not really that much different between them. Basically, if we're talking about the surface combat ships, so your battleships and your cruisers, basically bigger is better. You're limited in how many you can build. So like for the Americans, we can only build 2 super battleships anyway, or only have 2 in the game at a time. But you can have a lot of regular battleships and then a variety of cruisers. But basically the bigger is going to be better. They're going to be doing more damage. The super battleships can actually move a little further and have 1 more point of spotting distance. So your super battleships are actually pretty handy. A pretty good investment because they are actually a little bit better than the battleships in meaningful ways. Not just that their attack values are higher, which of course is true. And then destroyers are going to be a little different. You can build a lot of destroyers, but you don't want to use these really in direct naval engagements with cruisers and battleships because they're not going to do too great in those kind of fights. What your destroyers are good at is fighting submarines. If we look over here, we see for like a cruiser battleship, their submarine defense is 0. They're vulnerable to submarines, but your destroyer's submarine defense is 4. So submarines can't really tangle with them, and they are able to hit submarines. They're able to detect submarines and stop them even whenever they're in silent mode. And so you want destroyers to kind of hold down where you think the enemy subs are coming through and try to screen those out, but not use the destroyers so much in direct combat. Then there are also the carriers. And so there's escort carriers and regular carriers. And obviously the regular carriers are going to be bigger. You're going to want those for your battles. But the escort carriers are good for anti-submarine. They're good at attacking them. They're good at defending against them. And you can use, that's a good purpose for them, is to help with fighting enemy submarines as well as supplementing your main force. And then real quick, we'll look at how a carrier works for combat. I don't have any carriers over here in theater, so we'll just demonstrate with the Enterprise over here that hasn't left port yet, since this is still just the very beginning of the game. which actually I think I accidentally attacked with them already. So whenever we look closely at a carrier, we see it's got a couple different numbers down here. So where most units just have one strength number, carriers have two. And if you look real close, the little bitty icons, the one on the left is the carrier itself, and the one on the right is the aircraft it's carrying. Those two things can be damaged separately. They can be reinforced separately. So we have a lot of reinforced buttons over here, 1 or 2 each for the carrier itself and the aircraft that's carrying. To perform an attack with the carrier, there's no enemy units nearby, obviously, but basically you would just select the carrier. You would see the little combat predictors on any enemy ships that are in range, or ground targets as well. And then you would just click on them to launch your aircraft out to go attack them and come back. And then you would see the combat play out. You can also do reconnaissance missions. So if we hover over here, we see the little question mark. If we click, that will trigger a reconnaissance mission, which if these were unspotted hexes, we'd be able to see what was there. Now carriers, whenever we're looking at them, they may be the most complex unit in the game as far as the different options you have for handling them. So here we see set cap mode, so that's combat air patrol mode. There are several options. If we do auto, it's just going to give us kind of an automatic mix for attacking, intercepting, and escorting. And if we want to, say, have them focus on screening enemy fighters and do intercept, then they're gonna be used for that instead of attacking enemy targets. You're gonna have more strength for intercepting enemy fighters. If we do escort, you can set them to be escorting your bombers or other aircraft that are going out to hit enemy ground targets. So they're gonna do more damage to the enemy aircraft. But again, they're not going to be as strong for their direct attacks on ground targets or naval targets. And then also we can set them to ground if we don't want them to fly escort or intercept missions. And then we just want to manually set their attack targets like ground or ships, land or ship targets. And so you can probably leave it on auto most of the time, but if you want to kind of specialize what your different carriers are doing, you can come in here and play with that to kind of focus their strength on what you're wanting that carrier to do as far as attacking targets or intercepting or escorting. So if your ships take some damage, if you go to want to repair them, you'll find that unlike ground units, which can be reinforced as long as they have some supply, typically they can be reinforced in most places to some extent. Your naval units can only be reinforced when they're in port. So once they're out at sea, not only are they going to burn through their supplies, but any strength point losses that they take can't be repaired unless they come back to a friendly port. So again, just like with the ground units, the headquarters units are super important for pushing offensives, for making the units around them stronger. Naval units are they're going to need a friendly port to go to resupply, to reinforce. And so you're going to want to think about, before launching any kind of operation, you're going to think about which ports am I going to use to keep my ships in strength and in supply. But to actually repair them, if they're in port, then you just come here. You can use the reinforce tool, or you can come in here to manually say, which with the ships, they're going to potentially be more expensive to repair, so you might want to come in here and manually choose how much you want to repair them, or you can just do the reinforce tool, click on it to get as much as possible repaired. And so you'll see that we're going to bump up repair that ship, but this one we can't repair because they're not in port. But even if we move them into port, we'd have to wait till the next turn to repair them. So something to think about. Another topic that is kind of unique to your naval units is going to be convoy raiding. So we see these lines on the map. These are important to note. The red ones are going to be right now, the red ones are the friendly, blue ones are Japanese, and then if there's a white one, it's one that's kind of it's neutral or not turned on at the moment. But if we want to limit some of the movement of production points around for the enemy, we can raid these, and to do that, you're just going to move one of your naval units either onto the line or right next to it, and not next to an enemy unit. And then you can set their mode and turn on Raider, and you'll see that little dot comes on, and now they're raiding. Whenever you do that, it's going to kind of give away that that's happening, not the exact position, but the enemy's going to see like a marker saying that you have a ship out here raiding their convoy route somewhere nearby. So something to think about on that. But once you're raiding, you'll reduce the enemy production points every turn, and you're going to hit their national morale a little bit. So something that can be very effective. It's not going to be a huge hit, but it's going to eat away at their production points, especially if you can be raiding all of these convoy routes for the Japanese. You're going to be choking some of their points and limiting them over the long term of the game. Submarines are a little bit different, so they're actually going to be better at hitting the convoys than your surface ships, which using your surface ships is okay. Using your subs is going to be better because not only are they have a chance they can get away if they're attacked, but they can actually be stronger at this the higher your submarine warfare research is. So like for the US, this can go all the way up to level 5. Every level you go up, they're going to be a little bit better at, they're going to cause more damage whenever they do the convoy raiding. And for them to do it, there's not a raid mode as long as they're in the hunt mode and they're next to an enemy convoy route, they'll automatically hit that route. And so you want to pump up that submarine warfare if you're wanting to make that a big part of your strategy. Pump that up higher and higher to do more damage to the enemy convoy routes. If you're worried about the enemy doing it to you, you want to make sure you research anti-submarine warfare, and that's going to kind of mitigate it. Whenever the raid happens, it happens automatically at the end of the turn. These two values for each side are going to be compared, and that's going to be part of what determines how much raiding damage is done, how many production points are hit, how much national morale is hit. So if you want to do the subs, make sure you do the research to make them stronger for that part of it. All right, so that covered all the topics I wanted to hit for naval units in Strategic Command War in the Pacific. Obviously, this being the Pacific Theater, compared to some of the other Strategic Command games where naval stuff is always important, always useful, but not always the focus of the game. Here, controlling the sea is obviously going to be critical to any kind of success, because if the enemy knocks out your fleet because you didn't build enough, didn't do the research, didn't handle them well, or got them out of supply and in a bad spot, you're going to have a tough time getting your ground units, getting your air units close to the enemy to advance, because if you can't control the seas, you can't push the enemy fleet back. That's kind of a big part of this campaign. So important to understand naval units and kind of some of the quirks, how they're a little different from the ground units, especially when it comes to supply, to reinforcing them, and then just the general nature that the stakes are higher. Every time you lose one of your naval units, you're going to take a bigger hit to your national morale. And obviously, some of those units are going to take a long time to replace. If you have to replace a battleship, that's over a year of in-game time just to build it. Then if you're building it, if you're playing as the US, from building it, getting it over here, you're talking a lot of turns before a ship you lose is replaced. So naval combat, important to understand. The next video, I'll go into the air units. Obviously, another important part of this campaign where all three parts of the combined forces were critical to success, and you have to understand how they all work together. So stay tuned for our next video on air units, how they handle, and some of the important quirks of them, and how to handle them in Strategic Command. And thanks for watching, and to make sure you get that video, hit subscribe if you haven't already. Thanks. Bye.